You're listening to old Western stories, where dust settles slow, guns speak loud, and every tale rides straight into your imagination. Hit that subscribe and saddle up, the ride's just startin'. The trail forked 3 miles north of Dry Creek, where the land quit pretending to be friendly and started climbing toward the broken backs of the mountains. Marshal Elias Cooper reined in on the rise above it and sat his horse a long moment, listening to the kind of quiet that had weight to it. A man could tell a lot from quiet if he let it talk. Today it said something was wrong. The road should have carried a prison cart yesterday, steel barred and heavy, bound for Silver Bend with 2 deputies and a killer in irons. It had not arrived. A rider from Silver Bend had brought word, dust-caked and worried, and the judge's eyes had turned to Cooper the way eyes did when duty needed a back to sit on. Now Cooper was here, alone on the edge of the pass, working the scene the way he had 100 times before. He eased his gelding down off the rise, boots light in the stirrups, and drew to a stop where the main ruts of the road bent toward the mountains. The air smelled like old sage and cold stone, with just the faintest bite of snow hiding somewhere higher up. He swung a leg over and stepped down, joints answering with a dull protest he ignored. 50-odd years had their say, but they did not get a vote. He looped the reins over a scrubby pinon and walked out onto the hard-packed earth, eyes lowered, mind steady. 4 separate sets of wheel ruts crossed here most days, freight wagons, ranch teams, stage from Carson Way. But the marshal was hunting one particular set. Heavy, iron-bound, slow, it did not take long to find. The cart's tracks came in from the south, just as they ought to, cutting across lighter traffic like a straight line through clutter. The ruts bit deeper than most, weight and bad springs carving into the earth. He followed them with his gaze until they reached the fork, and then he saw the first wrong note. A prison cart did not wander. It took the shortest, safest way, right-hand fork, through the lower pass, then around to Silver Bend. That was the order signed on the papers, and the judge who signed them had no use for detours. But the ruts here, they told another story. Cooper crouched, the leather of his coat whispering as he went down. He laid 2 fingers along the wheel track where it curved. The soil was broken deeper on the outside of the turn, as if the driver had swung the team hard left in a hurry. The cart had taken the steeper fork, up into narrower country. Not choice, pressure. Something had reached out its hand right here and turned them. He looked up, following the line of that left-hand path with his eyes. The mountains crowded in there, walls drawing close, good ground for anyone wanting to stop a thing and not be seen doing it. His jaw worked once and settled again. There were boot marks in the dust along the fork. Some belonged to the deputies, their stride he recognized. Men walking alongside a laden cart, keeping pace with tired horses. But there were others. He shifted a little, leaning in. 2, maybe 3 extra sets coming from the brush just off the road. He saw the faint ghost of them where the soil held more sand than hardpan, angled in toward the trail, not out. Men stepping from cover, not traveling the road. Bandits, a man might say. Robbers seeing easy pickings in a government wagon, except bandits did not usually wear heels like that. Cooper let his gaze rest on one clear print near the fork. The heel was narrow and sharp, edge clean cut, not broken down from long miles. The sole showed a row of hobnails set neat and regular, not the scattered repair of a trail-worn cowhand. Town work, custom work, the kind ordered by men who did not worry about price. He rose and walked slow along the shoulder of the road, tracking with his eyes. Here a scuff on a stone where a man had turned quick. Here the faint drag of something heavy pulled a short way and then lifted. He found a broken matchstick, white against the dirt, too fresh to be old. No weathering, edges sharp. One of the deputies did not smoke. The other rolled his own and used flint. The prisoner, by all accounts, had been chained inside the barred cart. Cooper filed the match away in his mind and moved on. A small depression near the brush showed where a knee had pressed down, the imprint still crisp. A man kneeling, likely with a rifle. Had to be yesterday, maybe late morning by the way the wind had not yet blurred the edges. Cooper let his gaze drift south, judging time by the feel of the light. This was quiet work, and he preferred it that way. No crowd of onlookers, no talk. Just tracks and what they were willing to confess if a man listened patient. His hand, without thinking, brushed the inside of his coat where a tiny notch in worn leather marked an old bullet crease, souvenir of another transport gone wrong years back, when he had trusted a county sheriff who should never have worn a badge. He did not stay on that memory. He never did for long, but it rode with him, same as his gun. It was enough to remind him what happened when a lawman believed the first story handed to him. He straightened slowly and dusted his palms on his trousers. The road behind him ran open to Dry Creek, plain and empty. No signs of a long chase, no blood dappled in the trail, no scattered gear the way panicked men sometimes left it. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast, orderly, and right where a narrow pass could hide a lot of sin. He walked back to his horse, opened one saddlebag, and took out a thin strip of clean cloth. He tore it in half and tied one piece around a low branch at the fork to mark the spot. Habit. If a storm came in, sign could vanish quick. His memory did not. Still, markers helped in the telling later, when men behind desks wanted to know where and how. On his way back across the road, his boot nudged something half-pressed into the earth at the edge of the rut. Cooper stopped, bent, pried it free with careful fingers. It was a length of rope, but not the rough, fibrous kind freighters used. This was braided tight and fine, the strands darkened with tallow to keep out damp, the cut at the end clean as if done with a sharp knife, not frayed from strain. One side was flattened and stained, like it had been wrapped around iron and pulled hard, then dropped in haste. No teamster he knew in Dry Creek paid for rope like this. He turned it in his hands, thumb feeling where a manufacturer's mark had been pressed faint along one side, little diagonal lines, the style from a mercantile he recalled back in Carson, where only certain customers bought in bulk. Ambush rope, not trail rope. Someone had come prepared to stop that cart and bind what they wanted in a tidy, practiced way. Cooper tucked the length of rope into his coat, eyes lifting toward the narrow cut of the left-hand pass. The land up there waited, still and patient, as if keeping its mouth shut about what it had seen. He stepped back to his horse, laid a hand on the gelding's neck to calm him, then put his boot in the stirrup. "All right," he said softly, more to the trail ahead than to the animal. "Let us see where they took you." He swung up into the saddle and turned the horse toward the mountains, following the cart's bent ruts and the promise of that neat, expensive rope, deeper into the pass where planned deeds like to hide. The pass tightened around Marshal Elias Cooper as he rode in, the left-hand trail climbing between walls of rock that leaned closer the farther he went. Down below, country opened wide and honest. A man could see trouble coming for a mile. Up here, trouble could stand 10 feet off the trail and you would ride right past it. The air cooled with every turn, carrying a thin whistle of wind that never quite made a sound, just brushed past his ears and was gone. His horse's hoofbeats thudded soft on packed dirt, swallowed quick by the stone. It put a kind of hush over things, one that wasn't peace so much as waiting. Cooper followed the prison cart's ruts where they scored the ground, deeper now than they had been near the fork. The grade had steepened and the team had leaned into their collars, iron rims biting harder into the earth. He could see it in the way the grooves widened, in the little crescents of disturbed gravel flipped outward. Work marks, pressure marks. The sort that said the driver hadn't wanted to be up here any more than common sense dictated. Yet up here he had come. The marshal let his gaze move ahead of the horse, taking in every bend. The pass crooked against the sky, each turn hiding the next. Tight shoulders of rock closed down on either side, with only narrow shelves and scatterings of brush clinging where soil had found some excuse to hold on. No real cover for a big force, but enough for a few careful men who knew where to put themselves. He rode slow, giving his eyes time. The cart's tracks never wandered, just pulled ahead steady, a man doing his job under some kind of instruction. No wheel wobble, no brake marks, no sign of panic. But here and there on the edge of the ruts he saw the faint, repeating fall of those other boots he'd noticed at the fork. The fancy heels, the ordered stride of men who didn't shuffle. On one narrow stretch, where the trail leaned sharply toward a drop, he drew rein and stepped down. The prison cart's wheels had run close to the outer edge there, the outer rut crumbling the lip of the trail, sending little slides of gravel down the slope. Cooper crouched, fingers touching where the soil had given way. He looked at the inner side of the track. It showed the faint shadow of a brake shoe dragged just enough to steady, not enough to stop. A cautious driver being told to keep moving. He straightened slowly, eyes drifting to the slope below. If the team had balked here, if anyone had fought back, there'd be marks, scrabble prints, broken rock, maybe a scrap of cloth snagged on stone. There was nothing like that. It had been orderly so far. Too orderly. Back in Silver Bend, the judge had called the prisoner a danger to the peace of 3 counties, his words dry and cold around the edges. Cooper remembered the way the courtroom had gone quiet when the man was brought in, shackles and all. Not because he'd shouted or cursed. He hadn't. He'd sat down careful, hands folded, and watched Cooper with a gaze that never blinked much. Folks said he'd killed 2 men in a saloon in Winnemucca, not in a rage but because someone at a corner table had tipped him a nod. Not a hired gun with a showman's smile, more like a tool put to use. Tools like that did not walk free on their own. They got fetched. He stepped back into the saddle and moved on, the pass bending again. A shadow lay across the trail where the walls pinched in close enough a man could have stretched out both arms and brushed stone on either side. Here the ruts narrowed, squeezed toward the center as the driver kept his team away from the edges. Cooper reined in, letting the horse snort and settle while he looked close. Something glinted faintly on the ground near the inner wall. He swung down once more, boots crunching lightly on grit, and walked over. It was a spent cartridge, half pressed into the dirt. He eased it up with thumb and forefinger, rolling it in his palm. The casing was clean brass, not tarnished by long weather, and the rim bore the tiny stamped letters from a maker that supplied good rifles to men who could afford them. Not the kind of shell you saw scattered around a cow camp after boys had done plinking. He lifted his head and studied the stone to his right. A shallow scrape marked one rock at about shoulder height, the kind a bullet might leave if it kissed stone on the way past. If there had been gunfire here, it had been measured. 1 or 2 shots, not a running fight. He found no blood, no torn cloth, no shattered wood from the cart. Just that lonely brass piece and the small scar in the rock, like punctuation in a sentence he did not yet understand. Cooper slipped the casing into his coat pocket with the rope he'd taken earlier. Together, they felt like a story assembling itself, one quiet word at a time. As he walked back to his horse, he noticed a print set a little apart from the rest, in a patch where finer dust had settled. This one showed the heel and most of the sole clear, narrow, long, the weight set more on the ball than the heel. A man who walked on the front of his feet, keyed up or simply built that way. The toe pointed toward the inner wall, toward a narrow ledge above the trail where a man might lie with a rifle and look down unseen. The print was deeper than the others, as if its owner had paused there a moment, watching. Cooper let his gaze follow where those eyes would have been aimed. Down along the trail, to where a prison cart would grind and rattle its way up the grade, caged man inside, deputies in their dust. It was quiet now. Nothing moved but a small shred of cloud far overhead. Still, the marshal felt that old, familiar prickle along the back of his neck. Not fear, just awareness, like the air itself had changed weight. Men who planned a thing this careful did not always wipe their tracks clean. Some of them liked to stand and admire their work after. He mounted again and rode deeper, the pass twisting once more. The light grew thinner here, cut into long shapes by the rock shoulders. The horse's breath sounded louder in the hush, and Cooper's coat brushed the stone in places it had no business touching. The ruts stayed true, but after another 100 yards they began to show something new. The depth of them changed, rising and falling in uneven measure. He saw spots where the outer wheel had dropped into a hole, then been dragged out with effort, little banks of packed grit piled at the ends of the grooves. At one turn, he found where the team had halted. Both ruts ended in shallow mounds of gravel pushed up from the sudden stop. The prints of the two deputies clustered just ahead of the cart, overlapping. Behind them, the narrow-heeled boots stood out again, 3 distinct pairs this time, each arriving from different angles. From the wall, from the opposite side, from further upslope. Men stepping out on cue, no stray wandering. Cooper dismounted and led his horse by the reins while he studied the ground. Off to the right, near a jut of stone, something pale lay half hidden beneath grit. He moved toward it, stooped, and picked up a glove. A fine one, soft leather, inside lined with some light fabric. It bore a dark smudge along the palm where it had brushed against a wheel or dusty rail. The cuff was stamped with a maker's mark. Not local. Eastern. You did not find many such pieces in common bunkhouses. He turned it over, noticing one fingertip was torn slightly, as if its wearer had snagged it on something and tugged in haste, losing it without stopping to look back. He stood there a long moment, glove resting on his broad palm, listening to the silence press in. The pass breathed around him, stone and shadow and swallowed echoes. Somewhere uptrail a small rock clicked against another. Natural, maybe, or not. His horse lifted its head, ears flicking forward then sideways. Cooper's hand moved to the animal's neck, steadying more out of habit than need. He did not reach for his gun. Not yet. Men who watched from hiding liked a twitchy lawman. They read nervous hands the way he read tracks. He left the glove hanging from his fingers and studied the lay of the land. Ahead, the trail widened for the first time since he'd entered the pass, forming a short, flat shelf before bending out of sight again. The wheel ruts led straight toward it, but something about the soil there looked different, more churned than it ought to be. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, eyes on the ground. The closer he came, the more he saw it. A line across both ruts where the earth had been disturbed in a straight bar, like something heavy had been dragged sideways across the trail. Beyond that line, the prison cart's tracks did not continue straight on. They kinked sharply toward the inner wall, as if the team had been forced to angle away from something. Cooper reached the line and stopped. On either side of the trail, faint impressions marked where large rocks had once sat, round scars in the dust, edges still crisp. Those rocks were gone now, rolled or heaved aside to let other travelers pass, but their ghosts remained. Someone had blocked the trail with them, built a low wall the cart could not easily push through. No fresh gouges from the wheels showed on the ground beyond that bar. Instead, the ruts turned up toward a narrow notch in the rock, a side path he might have taken for nothing but a game trail if not for the heaviness of those grooves. That side cut climbed at a sharp pitch, tight and hidden, leading away from the main pass and its open continuation. The blocked line, the absence of struggle, the careful removal of the stones afterward, all of it spoke with a calm, deliberate voice. The cart had not been waylaid in chaos, it had been redirected. "You didn't run," Cooper murmured under his breath, more to the memory of the driver than anything else. "You were shown where to go." He looked up at the narrow side trail, feeling the weight of that choice settle in his bones. Whoever had wanted that prisoner had the power to stop a government wagon, move it off the proper road, and tidy up after like it was nothing more than a ranch chore. That meant money, influence, or both. And it meant whoever might be watching him now knew he had found the place where the law had been turned aside on purpose. He slipped the glove into his coat with the rope and the spent casing, then took his horse's reins and led the animal toward the notch, following the bent ruts that climbed out of the main pass and into even tighter, more secret ground. The stakes rode higher with each step, and the mountains seemed to lean in closer to hear what he would do next. The side notch took the trail and pinched it down until Marshal Elias Cooper felt like he was riding into the throat of something. The walls rose near enough to brush a stirrup if he wasn't careful, raw stone streaked with old mineral scars and thin seams of scrub trying to live where it could. Light came in slantwise, thinner, as if the sky had stepped back. His horse's footfalls turned hollow and close, each one swallowed almost before it landed. The air kept still, holding its breath. The prison cart's ruts ran ahead of him, climbing sharper now, the grooves carved deeper as the team had strained against the grade. Gravel had been kicked up out of those ruts and lay scattered downslope in small fans. A wagon didn't come up through ground like this by accident. It got brought here, steady, under orders. Cooper kept his gelding to a walk, letting the animal pick its way. No sense in hurrying what needed care. His eyes moved from the tracks to the edges of them and back, reading the signs like a man reads a page he's turned 100 times before. Those narrow-heeled boot prints showed regular now, on both sides of the ruts. Sometimes they paralleled the wheels, sometimes they angled in and out, as if men had been stepping up to speak to the driver or look into the cart. Not the spread-out shuffle of a robbery where everyone scrambled at once. This was measured, controlled, men walking where they needed to be and nowhere else. About 20 yards up, the trail kinked around an outcrop, and beyond that bend he saw the first place where the rhythm of the marks changed. The ruts, so constant till then, broke off their steady rise and deepened suddenly, biting hard into the earth before easing again. Cooper drew rein and swung down. He laid his palm in one groove, feeling where the iron rim had dug almost to rock. The team had halted here, pulled up short, weight thrown forward. The ground ahead of the ruts was piled with loose grit, scooped and mounded by hooves dancing in place. The deputy's boot prints came together again near the wagon's tongue, overlapping in a cluster, like men who had stepped forward when told. Around them, those other prints spread out in a half-circle. One set faced the cart's rear, another faced the side door where the prisoner would have been, a third angled back down the trail, watching the approach. No sign of men bolting or stumbling. No wide kicks of dirt where someone had tried to run. Whatever was done here had been done with words first, not bullets. Cooper walked alongside the track, measuring each step against what he could see. Near the rear rut he found where someone had set down something heavy, a rectangle pressed into the dust, the shape of a strongbox or tool chest. It had sat there long enough to leave an honest mark, then been lifted straight up again. A few inches away lay a small twist of wire, thin but stiff, curled like a spent insect. He picked it up and straightened it between his fingers. Chain wire, the kind used to double-lock shackles or fasten padlocks where extra insurance was wanted. The deputies would not have brought spare links like that for their own comfort. This had come from the men who stopped them. A memory moved across his mind, quiet as smoke. Back in Winnemucca during the hearing, one of the railroad men, good clothes, careful voice, had leaned toward Cooper outside the courtroom and asked, very polite, whether it was true this prisoner could ride all night and then stand up in front of a judge without a tremor. "They say he carried a ledger in his head," the man had murmured, as if commenting on whether names, sums, where the money went. Cooper hadn't answered then. Wasn't his way to trade talk in courthouse halls. But the phrase came back to him now, walking among the marks of boots and wire and heavy things. A man who kept a ledger like that up behind his eyes might be worth trouble to the right people. Maybe worth a lot. His horse blew out a breath behind him, ears flicking back and forth. Cooper listened with him. For a second there, beneath the stillness, he thought he heard a soft clatter higher up in the rocks, like a stone kicked loose and catching briefly against another before dropping out of sound. He didn't look up at once. Instead, he finished turning the bit of wire in his hand, then let it fall back to the dirt as though it meant nothing much. Only then did he raise his eyes, slow and unhurried, to the broken shoulders of the notch. The stone stared back, blank and pale. If anyone was up there, they were tucked in tight and patient. That was fine. He was patient, too. He went back to his horse and moved the gelding on, leading him a short stretch before mounting again where the ground grew rough. The redirected ruts pressed ahead, one wheel riding closer to the inner wall now, the other flirting with the drop. In places, marks showed where men had walked right against the stone, a handprint smudged on the rock here and there where someone had steadying himself. On one corner turn, he saw where a rope had bit into the edge of a boulder, leaving a faint, bright scuff as it pulled. They'd run a line from above, maybe, to help ease the cart around the bend without tipping. Whoever planned this knew the ground well enough to bring a prison wagon through hairpin turns without rolling it into the ravine. That took more than desperation. It took rehearsal. Further up, the notch opened by a horse length, no more. The ground leveled briefly there, forming a shelf of sorts. The ruts flattened, then spread just an inch wider, as if the cart had been angled a touch offline. Cooper rode to the edge of that shelf and stopped, studying. This had been another pause. The deputy's tracks diverged slightly, one set stepping to the left, one to the right, each stopping beside a shallow depression where a man might sit or be made to kneel. The fancy-heeled boots closed in on them from different angles. He could see where a boot toe had punched deeper into the soil just ahead of one deputy's prints, a stance that spoke more command than conversation. By the inner wall, close to where the cart would have stood, the dust was stirred by many smaller shifts. Men had stood close together there, moving around short distances, hands busy at locks or hinges. Cooper crouched near the wall, fingers brushing the rock. A faint scratch ran along it at mid-chest height, curving slightly, the kind made when metal met stone. He looked down and saw, half ground into the dirt, a tiny sliver of filed iron. His thumb found it, lifted it free. Not much bigger than a splinter, but the edge was clean, and one side showed the faint rounding of having once been part of a link. A chain worked at with a file. The prisoner's restraints had been altered here, inspected, maybe changed out. Not broken on the fly, prepared. There was something else, too. In the dust not far from that scrap lay a small, flattened stub of cigar. Cooper picked it up and sniffed at it. Strong tobacco, rich and heavy, cut with something sweet. The paper band had been stripped, but the quality spoke on its own. Not the kind deputies on territorial pay favored, nor the cheap twists cowhands rolled when they had a mind to. This was for men who conducted business in back rooms and liked their smoke to announce itself. He rolled the damp end between finger and thumb until it crumbled, then let the bits drop. The air carried no fresh trace of that scent now. What lingered instead was dust and rock, and the faint, bitter tang of cold creosote from a stunted bush clinging to a crack. The horse shifted behind him, giving a short, uneasy toss of the head. Cooper felt it through the reins and gave a quiet, steadying murmur. Easy. The gelding's ears tilted forward, then back, catching sounds he did not yet hear. Up above, too high to point to, something scraped once and went still. Maybe a marmot, maybe a boot sole. The mountains didn't offer explanation. He rose, dusting his knees, and studied the way the ruts left this little shelf. They did not go straight on, though they could have. Instead, they swung wide toward the outer drop before curving back in again, making room for men to stand between cart and wall. He imagined it. Deputies moved aside, hands likely ordered up. Others stepping in close to the barred door, voices low, perhaps one man speaking soft as any preacher while another worked at steel. No shouting, no wild firing. Just the quiet, practical work of turning a prisoner from government property back into somebody's investment. A man like that prisoner, with his ledgerhead and his reputation for doing what he was paid to do without flourish, would have drawn interest long before the judge's gavel fell. Some said he never gave up a name, even when a mining boss in Battle Mountain had begged him to point at anyone else and walk free. He'd only smiled thin and said, "That wasn't the bargain." Men who kept bargains like that were valuable to those who made them in the first place. Valuable enough to pull a cart off its legal road and drag it up a mountain by hand. Cooper eased back into the saddle and nudged his horse forward again. The notch narrowed once more, closing until the trail was little more than a ledge clinging to the hillside. The cart's ruts rode it like a tightrope, one groove scarred where rock had bitten into a wheel, leaving a chip pattern in the dust. Here and there, he saw where a man's boot had slid, toes cutting sideways to keep from tumbling. The sense of eyes on his back thickened, not sharp exactly, but steady, as if whatever had watched the deputies go through had not entirely left. He did not turn around. He just rode, hand resting light above the butt of his holstered gun, not touching it. It was enough for whoever might be watching to know he remembered it was there. After a time that could have been 10 minutes or 30, hard to tell under that dim, slant light, the trail widened again into a pocket of level ground. A bowl scooped out of the stone, no more than 2 wagons wide, with the far end blocked by a fallen boulder that looked like it had been there half an age. The prison cart's ruts came into that pocket and stopped. Not angled to turn, not poised to back, just stopped dead center. Cooper drew his horse up at the edge and let his gaze travel slow over the scene. The dust there was more torn than anywhere he had seen yet. Not wild, but marked by sudden change. Deputies' prints overlapped in patterns that had lost their tidy order. One set showed a deeper heel mark where a man had been driven back a step. Another showed toes dug in, a short, braced slide. Those fancy-heeled tracks still cut through it all, but now they overlapped the deputies' prints more often, close enough a man could have reached out and laid a hand on another's chest. Near the cart's rear wheel, the ground held a small, hard scuff directed sideways, like the butt of a rifle being swung to block or to strike. Cooper swung down once more, moving into the bowl with that same unhurried steadiness. As he approached the front of where the cart would have stood, something dark caught his eye against the pale stone of the inner wall, a tiny fleck no bigger than a fingernail. He stepped closer, squinting. It was a splash of brownish red, thin at the edges, darker in the middle where it had soaked in before drying. Fresh enough the color hadn't gone to rust yet. He reached up and brushed a fingertip near it, not touching. The height of it marked where a man's head might be if he'd been standing close and jerked sideways. Below it, half hidden in the dirt near the rut, lay a small, broken piece of iron, curved and tight-grained. He bent, picked it up, and felt along its length. One end terminated in a jagged bite, metal torn rather than cut, The shape matched the ghost of a link. A shackled chain, stressed past its design and snapped. There, in that little bowl of scraped earth and quiet rock, the trail that had until now spoken of order finally admitted to violence. Cooper closed his hand around the broken link, feeling its cool weight press into his palm. Whatever business had been done up here had turned, quick and hard, from calm arrangement to sudden force. The law had not only been turned aside, it had been struck. He opened his fingers, looked once more at the blood on the stone, then at the stopped ruts in front of him. Somewhere beyond this pocket, men had left with a freed killer and without 2 deputies. The mountains held their silence close, but the iron and the stain said enough. He slipped the broken link into his coat beside the rope and the shell casing and the glove, then lifted his eyes to the exit of the bowl, where faint prints led on. The job was no longer only about a missing cart. It was about men who thought they could lay hands on the law itself and not pay the price. The tracks that left the bowl did not wander. They pulled away from the stopped ruts like a decision made and not revisited, climbing along the shoulder of the notch toward thinner air and rougher stone. Marshal Elias Cooper stood a long moment in that hollow, his hand resting lightly on his horse's neck, and let the feel of the place settle in his bones. The little fleck of blood on the wall, the broken chain link in his pocket, it all said the same thing. Whatever control had held this job tight had slipped here, if only for a breath. Then the men who planned it had taken hold again and moved on. He mounted and nudged the gelding forward, following where they had gone. The trail narrowed after the bowl, slanting along a slope that fell away sharp on the right. The cart's ruts no longer rode even. One groove cut deeper than its partner, telling of a wagon listing under unequal load. Something had changed its balance. Weight shifted, men moved, maybe a door thrown open. Cooper's gaze traced the ground ahead. Near the outer edge he saw wide scuffs where hobnailed boots had slipped, grit pushed down into little slides. The deputies, or perhaps one of the other men, had fought for footing here. He could read the angle of it, the way a heel dug in against being dragged. Alongside those were marks that said the opposite, feet planted solid, weight braced, pulling. The sort of print a man left when he had both hands on somebody else. He reined in, swung down, and studied a patch where the dust held layers of story. The deputy with the longer stride. He remembered the description, tall, with a hitch in his right leg from a horse fall, had left a pattern of uneven steps. Here those strides shortened, became irregular, then merged into a jumble of shorter, deeper impressions. One boot toe cut sideways, turning, then vanished into a shuffling smear. A few inches from that, the narrow-heeled tracks overlapped, 3 pairs forming almost a circle. They had closed in on him there, taken something from him, his gun, his badge, his comfort, and passed it along. Cooper's eyes moved higher to a thorny bush clinging to the slope above the trail. A scrap of cloth hung there, dull blue, one edge ragged where it had torn free. He reached up, plucked it loose, and rubbed it between his fingers. Stout weave, the kind used in government issue coats. There was a faint line of darker thread along one edge where a seam might have run, torn open. No blood on it. Not here. He folded it once and slid it into his pocket with the other pieces of the story. His horse tossed its head, ears pointing upslope, then swinging back down trail. The animal snorted, uneasy. The air stayed still, but in that stillness Cooper heard something he hadn't before, the barest echo of sound not made by his horse or the wind. It was gone before his mind fitted shape to it, like a word half-heard behind a closed door. Could have been a man's voice carried wrong by the walls. Could have been nothing but stone talking to itself. Either way, he felt that subtle tightening in his shoulders, that sense that space behind his back had grown more important than it had been a few minutes before. He did not look around quick. He did not ride faster. He just set his hand on the saddle horn, gave the gelding a quiet murmur and walked him on, letting his boots crunch softly where he chose to lead. A little farther along, the trail shoved itself between two jutting rocks, forcing any wagon through a gate no wider than a team. The prison cart's inner wheel had clipped one of those stones, leaving a clean gouge where iron rim met rock. Chips of stone lay scattered, not yet worn into the dust. Cooper crouched there and saw something besides the gouge. A faint smear of darker color streaked low along the stone's face, at about waist height on a standing man. He touched it lightly, brought his fingers close to his eyes. Dust clung, but beneath it he made out the rusty shadow beginning to form. Not much. A brushed sleeve, maybe, catching blood from somewhere. Enough to say someone had been marked more than by the scrape in the rock. The deputies had not gotten away untouched. That truth sat with him as he straightened. Back in Winnemucca, after the hearing, a telegraph had come in from Piotch, the kind that arrived late and sour, bearing news no one wanted to claim. It had mentioned the same prisoner now missing up this mountain. Suspected in the arranging of certain accidents, it had said in tight clerk script. A mine shaft giving way a little ahead of schedule, a brake lever failing on a loaded ore wagon, a foreman falling from a ledge where the rail had been sawed through just enough. No witnesses left to argue any of it. Just one steady man in the background, making sure things went wrong for the right people at the right time. That sort of man carried a ledger all right, but it was written in who lived and who did not, and who profited on the turn. Cooper had folded that message then, put it with the others in his coat, and said nothing. It wasn't his habit to speak of what he knew until it changed what needed doing. Up here, among scuffed prints and thin blood smears, the shape of that motive hardened. Someone who depended on a man like that, the kind who could tip fortunes without ever standing in the street with a gun, would not let him hang if money and hired hands could help it. The trail climbed again, steeper now, forcing the team that had pulled the cart to lean hard into their collars. Cooper saw where the hooves had dug in deeper, where small stones had been rolled loose and sent bouncing down the slope. Between the ruts the dust was chopped and hammered by many boots. He read hurried steps in some places, long, purposeful ones in others. At one tight bend, a brush of juniper stood to the uphill side, its lower branches broken and bent. Beneath it the soil was churned more than elsewhere, as if men had crowded there for a moment, one may be shoved back into the limbs. A sliver of something pale caught his eye near the broken branches. He reached in and drew out a wooden chip about the size of his thumb, stained dark on one side. The end was smooth and curved, with a shallow groove running along it. Stock wood from a rifle or shotgun, knocked against rock or bone hard enough to take a bite out. The stained side smelled faintly of oil and something older. He turned it over once, twice, then let his palm close around it. A man did not use the butt of a rifle gentle. If the piece had flown here, something sharp had passed through the air along with it. A blow, a fall, a curse. He replaced the chip in his pocket, his fingers brushing against the broken link and the spent casing, like different notes in the same tune. The chill in the notch deepened, though the sun still rode somewhere above. Cooper's breath steamed faintly as he exhaled. The horse's shoulders moved under his hand, muscles working, and a line of sweat darkened the hair along its neck despite the cold. The animal kept flicking its ears from side to side, catching sounds suspect and dismissing them, only to catch them again. There was a place, some few years back over in Utah Territory, where Cooper had walked into a canyon much like this one at the tail of another bad trail. He'd found nothing but bones and wind in that one, the culprits gone 3 days ahead. He'd told himself afterward that he had come late by no fault of his own. It had not stopped him from waking some nights and seeing those empty places again. Up here he did not feel late. He felt watched. A faint crack popped the air to his left, rocks shifting with the daily heat perhaps, or something heavier dislodged by more than sun. The sound bounced once, then died tight against the stone. His horse stopped, head high, nostrils flaring. Cooper let the halt stand, scanning without moving his head too quick. Shadows lay in folds and creases along the walls, the kind a man could lie in all day if he had patience. If eyes were on him, they were old hands at the game. He could not see them. He did not need to. It was enough to know a story this careful did not simply run and not look back. Men who hauled a prison wagon off the road and up into a notch, who blocked trails with stones and filed chains, did their scouting. They would know the law might send someone. Maybe they even guessed who. Cooper clicked his tongue softly and eased the gelding on. No use standing still where the ground forced him into a choke point. Better to keep going until the land gave him choices again. The signs underfoot thickened. Between the ruts, narrow, trailing marks showed where something had been dragged. Not heavy enough for a man deadweight, but more than a loose chain. Maybe a rifle pulled by the barrel, or a satchel. In one place, the drag line ended in a messy starburst of scuffed dirt and then began again a few feet away, as if whatever had been moved there was dropped, kicked, picked up from a new angle. The deputy's boot prints grew less tidy, more broken. One of them had stumbled hard. Cooper could see where a knee had hit, leaving a deep impression and a scrape where bone nearly met stone. Beside that mark lay a small, dull glint. He bent and pried it from the dirt. It was a button, plain and metal, with the letters U.S. stamped faint on its face. The loop on the back was stretched and bent, threads still clinging. A coat had been pulled roughly enough to give it up. No blood caked on its edges, but the way the threads frayed told of haste, of hands not careful about how cloth tore. He held it between thumb and forefinger a moment, then tucked it away. "You're not done yet," he said quietly, to whichever deputy had worn it. It was as much promise as observation. The notch took him higher, and the sound of the world below fell behind. No bird calls, no cattle lowing, no distant hammer of a blacksmith. Nothing to remind a man he was still in a world with towns and roads and ordinary troubles. Only the close whisper of his horse's breathing and the creak of leather at each step. Once, far off beyond the ridge, he heard what might have been a gunshot, one flat crack carried by the air, softened into something almost like a board snapping. It came from so far away he could not say which direction for certain. Men hunted all through mountains like these. It might have been a hunter putting meat on his table 3 draws over. Or it might have been an impatient hand firing a warning at someone who had lagged behind. The sound bled into the rock and was gone, leaving only questions pressed in its place. Around the next bend, the trail split. One faint line of older ruts carried on straight, nearly washed by time, maybe made by freighters seasons ago before the weather shifted and made this route less worth the effort. The fresh, sharp grooves of the prison cart swung off to the right, up a spur that climbed toward a stand of twisted pines, clinging to a saddle between 2 teeth of rock. Cooper reined in, studying, then chose the newer marks without hesitation. As he turned his horse, his eye caught something intentional on a flat stone near the junction. A circle rubbed clear of dust, not by boot or hoof, but by hand. In the center of that circle lay a burnt-out match, laid straight as a compass needle. Its blackened tip pointed toward the spur trail the cart had taken. Men who cared enough to tidy up rocks at the main pass had left this lying too neat, too deliberate. A sign for someone coming behind, or a quiet joke among men who thought no one would live long enough to read it. Either way, it told him one thing plain: they'd expected a follower. He eased his horse along the spur, the air thinning further as he climbed. The stand of pines above grew larger with each step, their dark needles drinking up the light. The ground under them would be softer, he knew, the signs harder to see, but other traces would give things away if he looked sharp. Men could never help but leave some part of themselves behind where they camped or waited. He reached the first of the trees and felt the temperature drop like a hand had been laid on the back of his neck. The sun couldn't get in here proper. The soil turned to a mix of old needles and loose duff that muffled hooves. Still, the prison cart's ruts showed where it had been forced between trunks, the bark scarred fresh at wheel height on either side. Horses had shied at that squeeze. He saw where hooves had stamped and danced, where someone had cursed and yanked reins. Beyond that pinch, the ground opened into a small, hidden flat just big enough to hold a wagon and a few mounts. The pines screened it on three sides, and the fourth dropped away into a view of broken stone, offering a man a look at the country below without showing his own head. Cooper halted at the edge of that clearing and took in the story written there. The cart's ruts came in, turned, and stopped in the center. Around them the soil was thrashed with boot prints, some deep, some light, crossing and recrossing. He saw where someone had sat or been forced to kneel near the rear wheel, two knee marks side by side, toes dug in behind them. Another set of prints circled that spot, the narrow-heeled pair, stopping at intervals like a man walking slow and speaking quiet. Off to the left, three distinct sets of hoof marks stood apart from the wagon's team. These horses had been fresher from the depth and spring of the prints. Their riders had sat a little back from the main work, watching, perhaps the ones who paid, or the ones entrusted to see the job finished. Near one of those standing positions, a small, dark patch marred the earth, soaked deep into old needles. Cooper stepped close and knelt. He scraped at the top layer with his fingers. The smell rose up faint but clear. Blood heavier than the thin smear on the rock below, more than a nosebleed, less than a slaughter. It had soaked and clotted, then dried enough to flake when he disturbed it. A few short hairs clung in the mix, coarse and dark. Horse, not man. Someone's mount had taken a cut here, accident, punishment, or to keep it from going where it shouldn't. That alone didn't say much. Men rough with their animals were thick as flies in these parts. What said more was the pattern that led away from that patch. The deputy's prints diverged again beyond it. One set angled toward the drop, ended in a long skid, then returned lighter, as if a man had been led to look over the edge at something and then brought back on his feet, not his back. The other deputy's marks were less clear, overlapped by those narrow heels and by a different boot altogether, broader, with a worn left edge. Someone had favored that left foot. Cooper's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd seen prints like that before, in other places where trouble had been set up rather than stumbled into. The type of man who favored one leg tended to stand and give orders while younger, straighter-backed hands did the main work. He filed it away. All through the clearing lay small, discarded things. A twisted piece of cheap tin from a tobacco plug. An empty tonic bottle shattered against a tree, its label remnant boasting curative powers in fancy script. A length of horsehair rope, snapped and tossed aside. He moved among them with steady care, not hurrying, letting the clearing talk. Up near the far edge, where the ground dipped and the trees thinned enough to show a sliver of the valley beyond, he found what he had half expected and half hoped not to. A drag trail. It started as a scuffed boot line, then became two parallel grooves with occasional heel marks between. A man or men pulled along with their legs trailing. The grooves led toward a cluster of brush near the drop-off, then veered aside before reaching it, as if someone had changed his mind about throwing weight over the edge. No other sign there, no torn cloth, no hat, no bones. Whoever had been dragged either walked away under his own power after, or was carried further where the signs were thinner. The deputy's fate stayed wrapped in that uncertainty, like a card turned face down on the table. Cooper stood for a moment, the drag marks at his feet, and listened. The wind had picked up, just a touch, threading itself through the pine needles above so they whispered against one another. In that soft sound, he thought, for an instant he heard a wordless murmur, men's voices low, somewhere not far, carried and mangled by distance and timber. It faded quick, leaving only the sough of air. His horse turned its head toward the far end of the clearing, ears locked, body tense. The animal's nostrils flared, drawing in some scent Cooper couldn't yet taste. When a horse behaved like that, it meant something was close enough to matter. He turned that way, boots quiet on the needle-thick ground, and saw, in a shallow hollow partially sheltered by 3 leaning trunks, the dark ring of a fire. The stones around it were blackened, and a thin dusting of ash lay within. A dented coffee pot sat toppled on its side nearby, its spout buried in the dirt. He stepped to the ring and crouched, holding his hand a few inches above the ashes. At first he felt nothing. Then, just as he was about to draw back, a faint thread of warmth brushed his palm. Not the heat of coals banked for the night, but the last echo of a fire put out within the hour. One small ember, no bigger than a fingernail, glowed dull red where it hid under a layer of gray. It pulsed once as a breath of air reached it, then dimmed, not quite dead. Cooper watched it a moment, the weight of the mountain silence pressing down, and knew with the surety of a man who had trailed too many bad deeds to count that the ones who dragged a prison cart up here were not gone into history. They were close enough to leave a fire still whispering its heat into the air. ===CUTPOINT === Marshal Elias Cooper watched that ember breathe its last faint pulse of red, then covered it gently with the side of his boot, grinding ash until there was nothing left but cold gray. Men who cared enough to bank a fire usually meant to come back to it. Men who stamped one out in haste were moving on for good or in a hurry. This one had been smothered halfway, then left. They were close, all right, but not in this ring of stones. They were ahead. He straightened, let his eyes travel the edges of the little camp. The fresh sign lay thick, not yet softened by wind. Hoofprints pointed north, nose into the thinner timber, and boot tracks wrapped around them, some leading off toward the far edge where the flat ran out. The prison cart's ruts ended here. Beyond this point, only saddle stock had gone on. They'd taken the prisoner, the deputies, and whatever they wanted to keep and move to ground better suited for disappearing. Cooper led his horse to a low limb and tied him there, close enough the gelding could crop at what sparse grass threaded the needles. "Stay easy," he murmured, hand on the warm neck for a moment. The animal's ears twitched, catching the unease in his voice even if it didn't understand the words. Then the marshal checked his cinch, tugged his hat brim down a touch, and stepped off into the sign, on foot now. Tracking from the saddle had served well enough where the story lay flat and wide. Up close on men with guns, he preferred his boots on the ground. The trail leaving the camp was plain, a string of hoofprints, 5 or 6 mounts by his count, shod and well-fed, the impression deep, the stride brisk. Among them, lighter marks showed where at least one man had walked leading another horse rather than riding his own. The deputies, maybe, or the prisoner, chained to a saddle horn or to each other. The soil under the pines took sign without shouting it, but Cooper's eyes had long ago learned to read the small whispers. He moved slow, careful, keeping to the broken shadows, his shoulders brushing rough bark when the trees closed in. No hurry. Men who had just broken a prisoner out of government hands and climbed half a mountain with him would not be moving at top speed. They'd be conserving what strength they had, trusting the notch and the distance to keep the law off them. They didn't yet know the law had come alone. The ground rose by degrees, the trees thinning so the rock showed through in ribs and plates. The boot prints spread wider here. Men had walked out from the line at intervals, scouting, then folded back in. Hired hands who'd done this before by the look of it. Private guard, Cooper thought, the way a man considers whether, inevitable as long as rich men kept buying guns to stand between them and consequences. For a little stretch, the horses had been pushed to a short trot. The stride lengthened, hooves dug in deeper. Maybe someone had looked back, seen a shape on the trail they didn't like. Maybe that faint echo of a shot he'd heard earlier hadn't come from some distant hunter after all. A broken twig brushed his shoulder. A cluster of small stones lay scattered across the path where they'd been kicked loose fresh, still holding a bit of shine. He paused at a narrow rock slot where the trail squeezed between two standing slabs. On one side, a scuff near the top told of a rifle barrel striking stone. A man had been carrying it high, ready, not slung casual. They were not relaxed anymore. Cooper eased through the slot, hand resting light on the butt of his gun without drawing it. The air on the far side felt different, thinner, edgier. Not colder exactly, but charged in a way his skin noticed before his mind did. Sound changed, too. The mountains here did not swallow everything so tight, they let some noise carry. He heard, faint and wavering, the clink of metal on metal. A chain or stirrup iron brushed careless, and then the low murmur of men's voices, more than one. The words blurred in the distance, but the cadence had that particular weight men used when they thought whatever they were saying wasn't for outside ears. Cooper dropped his center of gravity instinctively, shoulders low, and moved off the main trace, letting the terrain fold around him. There was a line of rock outcrops to his left that stepped up like a natural staircase. He took them, one silent rise after another, until he found himself above the level of the trail. From there, belly down behind a boulder, he could look ahead without putting his silhouette against the sky. The view opened into a shallow hanging basin, ringed by trees and stone like a bowl someone had set near the ridge. In its center, among scattered boulders and scrub, stood a knot of horses, reins draped loose. Beyond them, where a line of rock made a low wall, a handful of men moved about, the set of their shoulders easy enough to fool a casual eye. Cooper counted heads. 6 men armed, their rifles and carbines close enough at hand they might as well have been in their fists. 7th figure, seated on a rock with his hands bound in front of him, chains glinting faint against his trousers. That would be the prisoner. Even from that distance, the man's posture carried a strange stillness, like the quiet at the center of a spinning wheel. On the ground near the rock lay another body, stretched out on a blanket, covered to the shoulders with a coat. Boots stuck out at the bottom, their toes pointed nowhere. Deputy, by the look of the issue leather. Near him, propped against a tree with his arms drawn behind him and tied, sat the second deputy. His face looked pale beneath trail dirt, but it was alive, jaw working as one of the guardmen talked at him. Cooper let his gaze move among the standing men. At least 3 wore the kind of fitted jackets he'd seen on private security out of Carson and Virginia City. Cloth meant to look respectable in a saloon, and not snag as bad on brush outside. Their boots matched the prints he'd been following. Narrow-heeled, good leather, hobnailed regular. One of them, heavy in the shoulders and a little stiff in the left leg, drifted near the prisoner while the others kept the perimeter, eyes on the approaches. Foreman type, Cooper judged, the man who gave orders and accounted for the pay. He shifted his focus to the prisoner. The fellow sat straight despite the chains, hands resting easy on his knees. His hair was flattened on one side where a hat had once sat. His jaw carried a day's worth of dark stubble. There was no strain in his face, no obvious bruises. If anything, He looked more like a man on a long wagon ride than one who'd just seen blood on stone. He turned his head a fraction, speaking to the foreman. The words didn't carry, but the marshal could imagine the tone, mild, measured. Men who arranged accidents with their ledger heads didn't waste breath. A faint breeze came up the slope, bringing snatches of sound. Night crossed the ridge no one will, then it thinned away again. Cooper watched a minute longer, committing the positions to memory. Two men near the horses, half turned outward. One tending the small fire they'd kindled anew, a stingy thing, more smoke than flame. One leaning against the rock wall, rifle cradled casual. Foreman and prisoner by the boulder. Deputy bound. Other deputy laid out. If he walked in open and straight, they'd cut him down before he'd gone 10 steps, and the bodies would vanish into some crevice or be rolled off a ledge for the coyotes. They'd done too much planning to balk at one more corpse. He eased backward off the boulder, retraced his steps across the rocky staircase, and came down a little nearer the level of the basin, keeping to the tree line. Terrain could do part of a man's fighting if he listened to it. The slope dipped on the far side, letting a careful walker come in from an angle that put rock between him and most of those rifles until he chose to show himself. He took that way, slow, sidestepping to keep loose stones from rolling, hand extended once to steady himself on a juniper's rough trunk. As he moved, he thought of that dead deputy under the coat, lying closer to salvation than he'd known, and of the living one bound upright, maybe telling himself help was too far off to matter. Duty meant arriving whether a man believed you would or not. A quieter part of his mind observed, almost idly, that this was the sort of day rich men counted on when they hired private guns. Far up a mountain, no witnesses but the pines, a deputy marshal outnumbered and by all reasonable measures outmaneuvered. He reached the dip, slid into it, and paused when he judged he was close to the edge of where they would start to hear him. There, kneeling behind a thick trunk, he loosened his holster tie, checked the set of his revolver, and lifted his head just enough to see over the rim. He was closer now. He could make out voices clearer. "So the boss says we don't let him get within sight of a judge again, you understand?" That was the foreman, the weighty man with the stiff leg. His voice carried a dry authority, the kind hired men recognized as connected to their pay. Ledger like that gets to town, folks start asking who signed what, who knew what. You think those people are going to let you keep your jobs then? You think they're going to let me keep mine? One of the younger guards snorted, spat. "Ain't my name in any ledger." "That's right," the foreman said, "and you keep it that way by doing as you're told." The prisoner's voice floated out, low and almost amused. "You're talking more than usual, Deke. Must be nervous." The foreman, Deke, gave a short grunt. "I'm talking just enough to make sure these boys understand they don't get paid if you don't disappear proper. Accidents only work when there's no trail back. You taught us that." The prisoner turned his head slightly, gaze drifting out across the basin. For a moment, Cooper thought those eyes might slide past the line of trees and find him. Instead, they settled on the bound deputy. "You should have taken the offer," he said, tone flat. "You and your partner both." The deputy spit a string of dust at his feet. "I wear this badge for the court, not for your kind," he rasped. His voice was rough, but it held. "You can run up and down these hills all you like. Law's still coming." "Law is already here," Cooper said, stepping out from behind the tree. He kept his hands low but not too low, empty at his sides, his revolver still holstered. He walked down into the basin at an even pace, not fast enough to spook them, not slow enough to look like he was worried about each footfall. 6 rifles and carbines swung toward him, metal glinting. Dust puffed at his boots where someone's first reaction tugged a barrel his way a little too quick. Deke's eyes narrowed. "That'll be far enough," the foreman called. "Who in hell are you?" "Elias Cooper," he answered, voice steady, carrying without a shout. "Deputy United States Marshal, I'm here on the court's business." He stopped well short of the nearest rock, where his next step would have put him in the dead center of the killing ground. He let the silence that followed stretch a moment. The prisoner watched him with that same mild expression, eyes running over Cooper's coat, his badge, his boots, weighing him as a man might weigh a horse at auction. "They sent you alone?" he asked. There was genuine curiosity in his tone, not derision. "Court sends who it has," Cooper said. "We were expecting a posse," one of the younger guards muttered. "Lucky day," another replied under his breath. The foreman's mouth twitched. "Marshal," Deke said aloud, settling his weight more firmly on his good leg, "you are a long way up the wrong trail. This here is private business. A ranch matter. You turn around and ride back down. Maybe we can all pretend we never saw one another." Cooper let his gaze drift briefly to the covered deputy on the ground. "You've already spilled U.S. blood up here. That makes it my business." Deke's jaw tightened. "Those men made choices. They aimed at my boys first." "I've been reading the ground since Dry Creek," Cooper answered. "It tells a different story. Stones rolled where they shouldn't, rope cut nicer than any freighter can afford, chains filed ahead of time. You blocked a federal wagon and dragged it off the road on orders. That buys you a day in court whether you walk in or I carry you." A murmur ran through the guards. One shifted his grip on his rifle, nervous energy tightening his fingers. Another took a half-step sideways, trying to angle toward a better shot. Cooper saw it without looking straight at him. Eyes were like gun barrels in their way. You kept them where you meant them to be. "What is it your boss is so scared of?" Cooper went on, letting his tone stay mild, the way a man might ask about weather. "What did he pay you all to keep out of a courtroom?" A ledger in this man's head. He inclined his chin toward the prisoner. Names and dates tied to mine shafts that fell in and wagons that lost their brakes. The prisoner's face changed for the first time, just a fraction. Not guilt exactly. More like recognition that the game was nearer its last card than he'd thought. Deke's eyes flicked to him, then back to Cooper. "You talk too much for a quiet man, Marshal," the foreman said. "You keep walking away from rich folks' troubles and you live longer. That's how this territory works." Cooper's answer was calm. "If I walked away from rich folks' troubles, I wouldn't be doing the job I was handed." A small silence followed, broken only by the creak of saddle leather as one of the horses shifted, impatient with all the standing. Somewhere a fly buzzed near the dead man's boots, circled and landed. "Last chance," Deke said at last. "We got you 6-1. One of you, one of him." His chin jerked toward the living deputy. "You figure the court's going to miss 2 badges as much as it misses a man like him." He nodded at the prisoner. "You turn around and ride back. Maybe we let that boy go. He can say he never found the trail. Folks will believe a scared deputy over a dead marshal." Cooper considered the deputy out of the corner of his eye. The younger man sat straight as he could, despite his bonds, watching the exchange with a kind of fierce hope he tried to hide. The law was a thing carried by men, Cooper knew. Every time it bent, someone decided first that bending was acceptable. He had already lived through one forced choice like this, years back, when a frightened sheriff had surrendered his badge in exchange for his own skin. Cooper had watched what that bargain cost the town afterward. He was not minded to watch that kind of rot spread again. "I don't trade the law piece by piece," he said. "You gentlemen set this in motion when you stopped that cart. It stops here." Deke sighed, a long, almost weary sound. "All right then," he said softly. "Boys." The word was less an order than a release. One of the guards, the one who'd edged sideways, jerked his rifle toward Cooper's chest. Cooper's hand moved in the same breath, drawing as he pivoted toward the rock to his right. The first shot cracked the air, echoing off stone. The slug took splinters off the boulder instead of his ribs. The man's aim had been rushed. Cooper's own revolver boomed a heartbeat later. He wasn't shooting to show off. He put his bullet where his eye had set it, low, through the firing man's thigh. The guard went down with a cry, his rifle clattering. In the shock of that first exchange, everything narrowed. Another guard shouldered his carbine and squeezed off a round. Cooper dropped behind the boulder fully now, dust jumping where the slug punched into the dirt where he'd been. The smell of burnt powder rolled across the basin, sharp and bitter. They had him pinned if he stayed put. He knew it, and so did they. Shots cracked, chipping rock, barking off stone. He counted them under his breath, tracking who'd fired and how often by sound and cadence. Above the din, he heard Deke shouting, keeping his men from rushing too quick. These weren't drunks in a street brawl. They were hired hands who understood overlapping fields of fire. He slid along the backside of the boulder, keeping low, and found a narrow cut where two rocks met, just wide enough to give him a view of the horses' hocks and the legs of the men near them. One mount reared, panicked by the noise. Its front hooves struck the ground near a guard's ankle, making the man jump sideways. Cooper fired through the gap, aiming not at a man's center but at the heel that flashed toward him. The round hit stone just ahead of the boot, spraying grit into the man's face. He cursed and stumbled back, colliding with another. For a few seconds, their angles on him all went wrong at once. He used those seconds, moving out from cover in a low, fast dash to a fallen log nearer the center, closer to the deputy and the prisoner. A bullet seared along his upper arm as he went, a hot, tearing line that staggered him, dropping his shoulder. He grunted, teeth clamping down on any sound beyond that. Pain was part of the fee. He hit the ground behind the log, rolled, came up with his revolver pointed toward the fire ring. One of the guards had taken position there, kneeling with his rifle braced on a rock. Cooper squeezed off a round. The man jerked, dropped his gun, and folded over, clutching his shoulder. "Hold your fire," the prisoner's voice cut through the echoes, sharp for the first time. "You hit me, this all goes wrong." It was not plea but command. For a heartbeat the gunman hesitated. Deke snarled. "Shut up," he snapped at the prisoner without looking his way. "You're a package, that's all." He swung his rifle along the line of the log, tracking where Cooper had been. "Marshal," he called, "you're bleeding. You don't make it down this mountain with one good arm. Lay that gun down and we'll talk about how this ends." Cooper's arm burned hot, wet beneath his coat, but his fingers still answered. He breathed slow, listening. One guard down, wounded near the edge. One at the fire hit. One hopping on a stung foot. Deke and two more still with clean lines. The deputy sat still, bound, eyes big but clear. The prisoner, chained, remained where he'd been, watching like a man at a theater, interested in how things played out more than in whether he walked away. Cooper drew one more breath and let his thoughts settle. Terrain, he reminded himself. Not all the ground belonged to them. "You boys ever heard how echoes work up here?" he called, keeping his voice as even as he could. "A man fires off the rock, sound bounces all kinds of directions. Hard to tell where it came from." There was a brief, suspicious silence. "What are you getting at?" one of the younger guards jeered. "You aiming to lecture?" Cooper didn't answer that directly. Instead, he shifted his body so his shoulders stayed behind the log, but his gun hand could reach around a little knot in the wood, changing the angle just enough. He fired once into a tall stone on the far side of the basin, deliberately missing every living thing. The shot smacked rock with a flat smack. The echo cracked back from the ridge opposite, loud as a second gun. One of the jittery guards spun toward that returning sound, convinced there was someone behind them. His barrel lifted off Cooper's line. The deputy, bound as he was, saw the opening. He lunged sideways with his chair, slamming his shoulder into the legs of the man behind him, a guard Cooper hadn't seen clearly before. The fellow toppled with a startled shout, his rifle discharging into the sky. Chaos opened a seam. Cooper came up from behind the log and put a round through the forearm of the man whose legs the deputy had taken out. The gun flew from the guard's grip. He howled, clutching his arm. Deke pivoted toward the deputy then, fury blazing up, rifle barrel dropping to chest height. That was the moment the prisoner moved. Until now, he'd sat like a carved thing. Now, in a swift, practiced motion, he twisted his chained hands around and drove one elbow up into Deke's ribs. The blow wasn't strong enough to drop a man as big as the foreman, but it jarred him sideways. His shot went wide, tearing bark from a tree instead of the deputy's heart. "He's worth more alive," the prisoner snapped, eyes suddenly bright. "Use your head." In that twist, Cooper saw something else. Under the chain on the prisoner's wrists was the faint outline of a small, oil-dark rectangle tucked into his sleeve. A notebook, maybe, thin as a folded handbill. Ledger after all, not just in his mind. Names riding up that man's arm like a fuse toward a court he never meant to see. Deke recovered quick, driving the stock of his rifle back into the prisoner's stomach this time. The chained man doubled over with a grunt, air knocked out of him. "You shut your mouth," Deke snarled. "You talk when Mr. H," he caught himself, bit off the rancher's name, "when the boss says you can." His attention stayed on the prisoner for 1 second too long. Cooper shot him in the side low where the hip met the belt. Deke staggered, dropped his rifle, and fell to one knee. The last unhurt guard, a thin fellow with nervous eyes, saw his foreman go down and broke. Instead of digging in, he bolted for his horse, cursing. "To hell with this," he yelped. He got one foot in the stirrup before Cooper fired again. This time he aimed for the saddle horn. The bullet smashed wood and leather. The horse screamed and reared, flinging the man backward. He hit the ground hard, wind knocked out of him, and stayed down, groaning, more scared now than deadly. Smoke thinned in the air. The echo of the last shot rolled off into the stones and was gone. For the first time since he'd stepped into the basin, Cooper didn't have a gun pointed at his chest. He stayed where he was a second longer, breathing, then rose slowly, revolver still in his hand, eyes traveling from man to man. "Anybody else want to argue with the court?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The fellow with the shot thigh moaned but didn't try to lift his rifle. The one holding his shoulder shook his head and let his hands show empty. The man with the stung foot sat down hard on a rock, hands up. The nervous rider wheezed where he lay. Deke knelt, one hand clamped low on his side, blood seeping between his fingers, face gone pale beneath trail dust. Only the prisoner remained upright, chains clinking as he eased himself back onto his rock. His eyes met Cooper's level. "Well," he said, breathing a little harder now, "does this part go in your report?" Cooper moved first to the deputy, keeping his gun drawn as he circled behind the chair. He cut the ropes with a knife from his belt. The young man sagged forward, then caught himself, muscles trembling. "You all right?" Cooper asked. The deputy nodded once, swallowing. "Yes, sir," he managed. Then his gaze shot to the body under the coat. "Sam!" Cooper walked with him, slow, and together they folded the coat back. The deputy beneath lay still, eyes rolled half open, a dark stain spreading across his chest where a bullet had found its mark. Tommy, that was the younger one's name, Cooper remembered now, let out a breath that was close to a sob but didn't quite get there. "They shot him at the bowl," Tommy said hoarsely. "I tried." He cut himself off, jaw clenching. Cooper put a hand briefly on his shoulder. "I saw the sign," he said. "You kept breathing. You did your job." He let the coat fall back over Sam's face, giving the man that small dignity, then turned to the living trouble. One by one, he collected the guards' weapons. kicking rifles and carbines out of reach before gathering them in a pile near the fire. The wounded he bound as needed with their own belts and strips torn from blankets. None of them would be running down the mountain in a hurry. When he came to Deke, the foreman stared up at him, lips drawn back in something that wanted to be a sneer and failed. "You think this holds?" Deke rasped. "You march us down there, tell your pretty story, show them your little souvenirs. My boss has more lawyers than you got bullets. He owns half the men who sit those benches." "Maybe," Cooper said. He tightened the bandage he'd wrapped around Deke's hip until the man hissed, then tied it off. "But he doesn't own juries that haven't met him, and he doesn't own the part of you that likes breathing. You're going to talk, Mr. Deke, when the time comes. You might dress it up, but you'll say enough." Deke's eyes slid away first. Cooper rose and faced the prisoner. For a moment, neither spoke. Tommy hovered a few steps back, unsure whether to be closer or further from this particular man. "They don't call you for simple robberies," Cooper said at last. "All this for a man who never once stood in the street with his own gun out." The prisoner offered a small, humorless smile. "Guns are loud," he said. "Accidents are quiet." His gaze dropped to Cooper's bleeding arm. "You're hurt." "I've been worse," Cooper replied. "Stand up." The prisoner did, chains clinking as he rose, moving slow but unbowed. Cooper stepped in, slid his fingers under the man's sleeve, and pulled out the oil-dark rectangle he'd glimpsed earlier. It was a thin notebook, bound in worn leather. He held it up where the prisoner could see. "You carrying all that in your head, or did you decide paper was safer?" The man's eyes cooled. "You think that book is what you want?" he asked quietly. "It's just weight. Names of men you'll never touch, because someone above you will set fire to that before a judge ever sees it." Cooper thought of other trails he'd ridden, other bits of paper turned to ash before they'd reached any honest desk. He slipped the ledger into an inner pocket anyway. "Maybe," he said, "but today your job is done. You're going back in irons. Court can decide what gets burned." Something flickered in the prisoner's gaze then, a flash of calculation, sharp as a knife. His eyes darted once to Deke, then to the guards, taking in their injuries, their sagging shoulders. The balance had shifted. If he wanted out now, it would not be by the clean, planned route he'd envisioned. It would be over someone's corpse. Cooper saw the decision forming before the chains clinked. The man moved fast, considering the weight on his wrists. He twisted, reaching for the nearest fallen rifle on the ground, hand closing over the stock. Tommy shouted a warning. Cooper already had his revolver half raised. "Don't," he said. The word cut through the air, flat and certain. For a heartbeat, the prisoner paused, hand on the gun, eyes locked on Cooper's. Options flickered there: run, shoot, die, surrender. Men who'd built their lives on control did not like any choice that handed their fate to another. In the end, pride made the call. The prisoner yanked the rifle toward him, barrel swinging up clumsily. Cooper fired once. The shot hit square in the man's chest, just below the collarbone. He rocked back as if a hand had shoved him, sat down hard on the rock, then slid off it, chains rattling against stone. He lay still, eyes open, surprise stamped across his features as if he hadn't expected the world to end so simply. Tommy stood frozen, breathing fast. Deke closed his eyes briefly. Whether in regret or calculation, Cooper couldn't say. "I told him not to test you," the foreman muttered. Cooper holstered his gun with a small, precise motion. Killing was a last resort, and it added its own stones to the weight a man carried. This one had put himself on the path years ago, but that didn't make the final step feel lighter. They spent the next hour turning a battlefield back into a trailhead. Tommy helped, shoulders squaring as the work steadied his hands. Together they rigged makeshift litters and arranged the wounded guards in such a way they could be led down the mountain on their own horses, tied firm. Sam's body they wrapped in a blanket from the camp, binding it with care. The prisoners' remains they secured separately, chains still on. By the time they brought Cooper's horse up from the pine camp, the sun had shifted west, sending longer shadows down the ridge. Clouds had gathered near the higher peaks, graying the edge of the sky. They started down in a slow, strung-out line. Cooper in front, Tommy in the middle leading two horses, the wounded man's reins looped to his saddle horn. The others roped together, pain and fear keeping them docile for now. The path they'd sweated up felt different going down with that many lives attached to it. The notch still closed in, the stones still watched, but now there were voices. Tommy's low curses when a horse stumbled, the occasional groan from a bound man when his wound jolted. Somewhere below, in the hollow where the cart's ruts had stopped, Sam's blood marked the rock. Farther still lay the fork where honest road and crooked trail had parted. As they rode, Tommy cleared his throat. "You think the boss, the rancher, he'll just sit quiet when he hears?" he asked. There was no need to name which boss. Out here, there were only so many men who could afford this many guns. Cooper kept his eyes on the switchback ahead. "Men like that don't sit quiet," he said. "They send lawyers, they send money, they send people to say a marshal came up a mountain and shot hired hands without cause." "Is it true?" Tommy's voice held honest worry. "Any of it? We've got rope, spent shells, chain links, a ledger in my pocket, and 6 men who can testify which way that cart was pointed," Cooper replied. "Truth is what you carry steady enough not to drop when someone shakes you." He shifted in the saddle, his wounded arm throbbing in time with his heartbeat. "Won't be the first time a rich man leaned on the law, won't be the last. Our part is to stand where we're put till someone else relieves us." Tommy was quiet for a while after that. The trail widened briefly where the notch gave one last view of the valley below. In the far distance, the glint of a river showed, and beyond it the faint haze that hung over Silver Bend and the scattered ranch spreads. Civilization, some would call it. To Cooper, it was just the next place where trouble put on a different face. He let his horse stop there for a moment, the others bunching up behind. Deke shifted in his saddle, groaning as rope bit into his injury. "You could have walked away," the foreman said, voice thinner now. "Plenty do. You'd sleep easier." Cooper looked out over the country spread below, the roads like faint lines scratched by some restless hand. "Sleep's never been something I trusted much," he said. "I'll settle for looking a deputy in the eye when I tell him why his partner's not riding home." Deke gave a humorless snort that ended in a grimace. "Men with money," he muttered, "they'll just hire more like me." "Likely," Cooper agreed. He touched his horse with his heel, starting the line moving again. "Then I'll just keep riding the ones I find." They picked up the old wagon road near the fork as the late light bled red along the western rim. The tracks of the prison cart still marked the earth there, turning where they never should have turned. Cooper glanced at them once, then let them go. The next rider who came along would see only a scar in the dirt, not the story it carried. That was all right. The important parts were with him now, in his pockets, in the men tied to their saddles, in Tommy's tired eyes, and in the quiet ledger of his own memory. As they headed back toward Dry Creek and whatever waited beyond, questions from judges, pressure from men in good suits, maybe a letter from a ranch house written in fine ink and full of polite threats, Cooper felt the familiar, settled weight of it all on his shoulders. Men with money would bend the law any way they could reach, he knew. They always had. The only thing that kept it from snapping was the few who chose not to bend with it. He shifted in the saddle, winced as his arm throbbed, and let the horse find its rhythm. The trail behind him was marked in ash and blood and broken plans. The one ahead was just dust and distance for now, waiting for whatever test came next. He rode into that fading light without hurry, a lone figure between the high country's silence and the noisy towns below, carrying the knowledge that this wouldn't be the last time a rich man tried to make accidents out of justice. But for today, at least, the prisoner cart that never arrived had been accounted for, and the law once turned aside had found its way back onto the trail. You've been riding with old Western stories. If the tale hit your mark, give it a like, drop a comment about your favorite part, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next trail we ride. Don't forget, hit that subscribe so you're always in the saddle, and you'll always be ready when the next story rides in.